On this video, I'm continuing in the book of Hebrews, chapter 2. Um, we stopped at verse 4 after looking at the first warning section of the book of Hebrews. What I'd like to do now is continue, and I will read the Greek text, give a translation in English, followed by a brief commentary and application. So, as we come to verse 5, the writer of Hebrews is continuing to talk about Christ as the pioneer of our salvation. And he's showing the superiority of Christ still over angels. And so we read in verse 5, Ugar angelois hu petaxin tain oikumenein tain melusan peri ches lalumen. For not to angels did he subject the earth about to be inhabited, concerning which we speak. He did not put the earth under the feet of angels, he's saying, but humankind, mankind. And so he continues in verse 6. Dia marturata deputis legon, ti estin anthropas hati memneske autou, huias anthropou hati episkepte autan, elatosas autan, braku ti par angelus, doxe kai time, estephanosas autan. Panta hupetaxas hupakato ton padon autu. He's quoting from Psalm 8. What is man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you visit him? You have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor, and you have placed all things under his feet. He's quoting in the Septuagint the Hebrew Ma Anosh ki tizkarenu uvenadam ki tivkadenu v'chasrehu me'at me Elohim v'hadar b'kavod te'adrehu tamshilehu b'ma'aseh yadecha kol shata tachat raglav. In other words, that is the Hebrew, and the Greek is what we just read. So he's quoting from Psalm 8. And what the psalmist is looking at at the first level, we could say, he's looking at how when I see the heavens, which is simply your finger work, I have to ask, what is mere man that you remember him, or the Son of Man that you visit him, that you give him the time of day? And yet you've made him a little lower than God, or we could translate it a little lower than the angels, depending on how we translate Elohim here. It can be angels, it can be God. And you crown him with glory and honor and put all things under his feet. When we look at the first level of interpretation, it's looking at how the Lord put humankind over animal creation, the highest, the epitome of God's creation. He goes on to describe that in the following verses. Something that he did not do, let's say, that was not done, I should say, in the Babylonian account, Enuma Elish. There, man is just an afterthought. Here, we are the epitome of God's creation. So that's the historical context. At one level, we could say at the first level of interpretation. And I would see this as a typically messianic psalm. So we're going to see now the application by the writer of Hebrews to Christ. And so he quotes the text that we read in the Greek. He's quoting from the Septuagint. And then he goes on to talk about it and apply it to Christ. Notice verse 8. Ento gar hupatak alto tapanta uden afeken alto anupataktan nun de upo haromen alto tapanta hupatetagmena. For in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subjected to him. But now we do not see yet all things having been subjected. In other words, when we look at creation, we do not see everything subjected to man. And he's focusing on everything here. We do not see everything subjected. However, we do see Jesus being made a little lower than the angels over all things. And again, he's quoting from the Septuagint about the angels that Jesus was made a little lower than. So in verse 9, he goes on, Tan debraku ti parangelus elatomenon blepamen Yesun diata pathematu thanatu daxe kai teme Estephanomenon hapos karati thau huper pantas gusetai thanatu. But we see Jesus having been made a little lower than the angels on account of the suffering of death, having now been crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he might taste death on behalf of all. We see Jesus, though, the writer of Hebrews is saying, who is over all things, but who was made a little lower than the angels. He became human, and as the perfect God-man, fully God and perfect man, he became human on account of the fact that he would taste death for us. In other words, he became a human being, and yet without sin, as the perfect God-man, that by the grace of God he might taste death on behalf of all. And now we see him exalted, crowned with glory and honor above the angelus, above the angels. What is beautiful about this text, Jesus was willing to say, not my will, but yours be done, Father, and be made a little lower than the angels in taking upon human form, and yet without sin, fully human and yet sinless, as the perfect God-man. And by the grace of God, he tasted death for all. It's my understanding that the all here means he died for everyone. I believe in unlimited atonement, that Christ died for the whole world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying that's who Jesus is. And of course, one needs to believe in him to experience the effectiveness or the effects of his atoning work for themselves in a personal way. But as we go on here, he's showing the contrast between Christ and angels. Angels were never able to bear our sin penalty and conquer death. Only one who became human, as the perfect God-man, could do that. And then he goes on to discuss the results of that. Notice, epipimgar auto di hantapanta kai di hu ta panta. Palus huius eis doxan agaganta tan archegon te soterias auton dia pathematon teleosai. For it was fitting for him, on account of whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons into glory, to perfect the pioneer or the pathfinder of their salvation through suffering. I believe what the writer of Hebrews is saying, it was fitting for the one who created all things, being God the Father, on account of whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons into glory, to perfect the pioneer, the pathfinder of their salvation through suffering. Jesus did not have to be perfected as far as having sins forgiven or anything, because he was sinless. He did not have a sin or a sin nature like we do. However, perfected in the sense of becoming that perfect pathfinder who could cut the way through the thicket of death, could provide atonement for us. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is going to go on to say, to show how he has become our archegon, our pioneer, or our perfect pathfinder. And so he goes on in verse 11, Ha tegar hagiadzon kai hoi hagiat saminoi ex genas pantes, di chen aitian uk episkunetai adelphus autus kalin. For the one who sanctifies and the ones who are being sanctified are all out of one, on account of which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. What he's saying here, in my understanding, is the one who is setting us apart for glory, which is Christ, and those who are being set apart, which are believers in Jesus, are all ex genas pantas, all out of one. We're one with him. And he proves this because he was not ashamed to call them brethren, saying. Now he goes back to the Hebrew Bible and to Psalm 22, and he quotes it by saying, Legon apangelo ta anamasu tois adelphois mu in messe ecclesias neso set. I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the church, I will praise you. He's quoting here from Psalm 22, which is a lament psalm. And we're looking, there's three parts to a lament psalm. There is the lament, and then there is the petition, and then there is the declaration of praise. And that lament psalm of Psalm 22, I believe, is a typical, prophetical, typical psalm that points to Christ in its final application. And when we read the psalm, when he comes to that section of declaring the greatness of the Lord in delivering the psalmist, he said, Asapra shemcha le'achai, betokachal achalecha. That is, I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. That is what he's quoting from in the Septuagint. And so Jesus became human, and after his suffering that we see in the first part of that psalm, typically, antitypically applied to Christ, we now see him declaring his name among the apostles, among the brethren. And so he quotes this to show the oneness between Jesus and all of us. represented by the apostles and those basically who received that declaration that he gave following his resurrection. But then he goes on to quote Isaiah to prove the oneness that he has accomplished from those who are being sanctified by him, the sanctifier. And so in verse 13 it reads, Kai Palin, ego essamai pepoithos ep auto, Kai Palin, edu ego kai tapandia ha moi edukin ha thaas. And again, I will be confident in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God has given to me. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17, and Isaiah 8:18. And so in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17, if we're looking at the Hebrew, and he's quoting from the Septuagint, we're looking at the Hebrew, it reads in verse 18, Hine anochi v'hayeladim asher natan li Adonai, le'otot u'lemoftim b'Yisrael, me'im Adonai Tsevaot ha'shochen b'har Sion. That is, behold, I and the children whom God has given me shall be signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells in the midst of Zion. So Isaiah and his children become signs to Israel at that time, during the time of King Ahaz. And then it's quoted again in verse 8, actually verse 18, and so we just quoted that. But what we're looking at here, I believe, is the combination of Isaiah and his children being applied now to Christ and his children in the church. I think that's what is being applied here. And when he says, I will be confident in him, it's talking about the Lord now who's going to carry out the work of redemption. And Isaiah becomes a type of Christ. And so what I see the writer doing here is linking Isaiah and his children with Christ and his children in the church, showing how that we now have become one, the one who is sanctifying and those who are being sanctified. The sanctifier is Christ, who's setting us apart for glory, and those who are being sanctified represent the church. And Isaiah and his children become typical or types of that, I believe, in the mind of the writer of Hebrews. So then we move on in verse 14. It reads, Epe unta padia ke koinole ken chaimatas kai sarkas kai autas paraplesios metesken ton auton Kenadia tu thanatu katargese tan takratas ekanta tu thanatu tu destin tan diabalan. That is, since the children partook of blood and flesh, he likewise, that is Christ, partook of the same, in order that through death he might render inoperative or void the one who is having the power of death, that is the devil. So the first thing that Christ accomplished by taking upon human flesh as the perfect God-man, something angels did not do, he voided or conquers death, and he conquered the one who is having the power of death, that is Satan, and that is death itself. So Jesus, through death, made inoperative the one having the power of death, and that is, he's conquered the power of death and Satan and all of that by his death and glorious resurrection. And then he reconciles those that come to him. Notice, kai apalaxe tutus, hasoe fabu, thanatu di pantas tu zain enakoi esan duleas. And he did this that he might reconcile, make friends of those, as long as they were having the fear of death continually and were liable to that fear while they were living. And that's really all of us having the fear of death. Death can be a fearful thing, very fearful. Death is the last enemy. But what we have here is that by Christ, he has now reconciled those who have that fear, and that would be all of us, through our faith in him, know that we have been reconciled to Christ, made friends with him. And as a result, we are heirs and joint heirs with that victory over death. And then he goes on in verse 16. U gardepu angelon epilambanetai ala spermatas Avraham epilambanetai. For not, of course, is he helping angels, but he's helping the seed of Abraham. And I think the seed of Abraham represents all believers here. In other words, he's helping the spiritual seed of Abraham by his victory over death, something angels did not do. Angels were not able to do that, but Jesus did. And so he goes on to talk about how now we have a wonderful intercessor. Hathen, Ophelin katapan tois adelphois hamoiothenai, kena eleemon genetai kai pistas archiarus ta prastanta an esta helaskestai tas hamartias tu lahu. Wherefore, it was necessary, according to all things, to be made like to the brethren, like to us, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest with reference to the things of God, to make propitiation or satisfaction, hilaskestai, from hilaskamai, to satisfy, to make satisfaction for the sins of the people. In other words, we now have a perfect high priest who is merciful and who has been faithful and who has been able to make satisfaction to his Father because of our sins. And what he's really saying here is that we have one who has satisfied the, can I say, by his atoning death, the paid, or let me put it this way, paid for our sins through his atoning death, and the Father is satisfied that the death has accomplished that. And we can go to him anytime. We now have a merciful and faithful high priest who really continues by virtue of his sacrifice to make, can I say, supplication on our behalf. I'm reminded of 1 John chapter 2. We have an intercessor that we can go to any time, who is our intercessor before the Father, who is our high priest. And then he goes on, in hogar pepanthen altas perastes, that is, in whom for he has suffered being tested. In other words, in whom, speaking of Christ, he has suffered being tested, and he is able, dunatai tois peratsamenois ba athenai. So he is able to help those who are being tested. What a beautiful thought here, that Jesus is able, by our becoming our great high priest, to having suffered, he was tempted in all points like as we are, and yet without sin. And so, being tested, he's now able to help those who are being tested, those who are being tempted. And that would apply to everyone. And so, the good news is Christ has become the victorious, ascended, exalted high priest who is at the right hand of God the Father, and something angels could not do. And that's why the writer of Hebrews is saying, let's go on with Christ. Let's don't go back to the worship of angels. Let's press on with him, because it was Jesus that became the archegon, that became that perfect pioneer, that perfect pathfinder who cut the way through the thicket of death for us, that through our faith in him, we are joined with him. And we now have become one with him, something angels were not able to do. And hence, we have a great high priest who ever lives to make intercession for us. He's merciful and he's been faithful. And so, therefore, go on with Christ. You know, one of the greatest things we can do in our life is to make Jesus our great King and High Priest.